I would like now to complete the chapter 3, technical parameters, and to talk about the last parameters, retention period, the last and not the least. As we could see in these chapters, we have seen that some parameters such as recovery point objective or recovery time objectives are not so easy as they can be, especially regarding the recovery time objective. We could see that there are different stages in these parameters. It's not a simple parameter to set as it is. You have to consider all the different stages and really think about all these stages before setting this recovery time objective. So now the retention period is also really important to set. You have to set it correctly, because if you do not do it, simply means that you will not be able to restore in some situation. I'm going to explain why this situation can occur. So what is the retention period? It's expressed in time units. Okay, it defines the times where you have to keep the backup. You have to keep the data on your storage, on your secondary storage for restoration, or if you want to keep it for example, for legal compliance or some business requirements. The things which are important to know is, first, that the retention period depends on the nature of the data to be saved. Yes, there is no only one retention period on your backup policy. You will have to define different retention period, because regarding the value of the data, you will not keep this data as long as if it's production data or if it's development data. Okay, if the data is really critical, it will be kept for more long time than if it's only for development, for example. So let's keep in mind that retention period is not only one parameters. It may be different time units for keeping data in different amount of time. This is the first things to know. The second thing is important to know is that it also depends on the secondary storage medium that you are going to use. You are not going to keep the data that have been backed so long as in a backup in disk storage, for example, or in tape storage or in cloud. Regarding this secondary storage medium that you are going to use, it will be a different time. It will be maybe 1, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 1 month, for example, on a duplicated storage, for example, but it may be very longer if you want to keep the data on tape, for example. All the motivation to keep data are mainly regarding economic. It means that it depends on the money that you want to spend. It's cheaper to spend to store some data on tape, for example, or on cloud, than keeping this data, for example, on disk. So depending on the storage that you're going to use, retention period will also change regarding some specific economics parameters. So what is important to understand is that retention period is different for user and administrator. Yes, in fact, this parameter is perceived really differently between your users and between you, the administrator. You have just to keep in mind that you don't have the same skills as your user or your managers. If you are simply talk about retention, people will don't know what you are talking about. It's completely abstract notion, of course. Their perception of the retention period is really different from yours. So what is important to know? The end user, in fact, is simply express a need to restore data after a corruption or after a disaster. Okay, so it's really the only thing that matters for him. It's the only thing that the end user or the manager is going to express when you are going to keep the data. The other thing which is important is that retention period when that you are going to define at the level of the backup software is going to start from the time the data is going to be written on the secondary storage. So the time when the user want to restore or when the user has lost his files and the time where the data has been backed up on the secondary storage are really different. Okay, if you understand that, you will understand that the notions are very different because you are not talking about the same time. The time when the file has been deleted is what matters to users. The time where the data is going to be stored on the secondary storage is the one which is important for you, the administrator. So the perception is really different between users and you, the administrator. This is why there are some issue to set the retention period not correctly, because it's not the same time. Now, the errors to be avoided in terms of retention is very important because when I'm performing some audits on infrastructure, in 90% of time or 9 under 10, the retention period is badly set. It is not correctly set, in fact, because the perception is not good, as I explained. Okay. When you're going to define this retention period parameter, we will have to talk to your manager, you will have to talk to the key user, or maybe someone which is going to tell you how long the data must be kept on the secondary storage. The answer that you are going to have is, roughly speaking, like that. The data must be kept for 1 week. 1 week is here an example. It may be 1 month, 1 day, or 1 year. Okay, it doesn't matter. The only thing that is important for you is that it is the only answer that you are going to have from the user or from your manager. The data must be kept for a certain amount of time. The reflex of the administrator is to set the retention period at the same for the same time. Okay, if you got the retention for 1 week, you're going to set the retention period for 1 week at the backup software level, and this is why there will be a real problem. I'm going to explain why setting the retention period as it is will simply mean that we'll not be able to restore. I'm going to detail the example as follows. Okay. The important caveat is that retention period is not the time interval during which data can be restored. It's really important to understand that. Okay, to illustrate this problem, this is an example. Okay, you can see the backup, which is a T. You got a T like a backup solution. The file is created. Okay. When the backup is going to occur, you will get a copy of the backup. Okay, the copy will be kept on the secondary storage. At the time that the data will be memorized in the catalog, we will talk about it further in the further chapter, and the data will be stored on the secondary storage, then the retention period is going to start. So in our example, you set 1 week retention period for the data. So it means that the next backup, which is scheduled, for example, 1 week later, will also be the same as the end of the retention period. Now, considering that a user is going to perform file deletion, let's consider that the file deletion occurs on Friday, at the end of the week, as an example. Okay, so now the time reserved for restoring a lost file is expressed like that. The start is since the file deletion, and it is ending, the time window is ending at the end of the retention period, because after the file will not be will not be kept on the storage, and it will not be able to be restored anymore. Okay? Now let's imagine that the user is performing a restore request. Considering that the user is asking for a restore request in the early morning on Monday, as an example. Okay, it's 9:30, the user is coming to the company and he wants you to restore the file deletion. You know that he has deleted accidentally the file on Friday. He is really aware of that. The problem is that you will not be able to restore the file. And the other problem is that the perception by the user since the disaster is different from yours, because the users know that the file has been deleted on Friday, you are now on Monday, so it doesn't mean 1 week. And moreover, you have been asked to keep the data for 1 week. So you can see in this example that between Friday and the next Monday, it is less than 1 week. It is less than the one that have been asked for you to store. Okay, so it's really a problem for you, because you will not be able to restore in this situation, even if you think that the retention period of 1 week was the good retention to set. Okay, so now I'm going to explain to you how to set the retention period correctly. You could say, okay, so they asked me to keep the data for 1 week. Okay, let's consider the retention period. Let's put on the software level a retention period of 1 month, for example. It's not a good way to do it, because keeping data more often than what you need is not as good as possible. It's not good even if because it is costly. If you are keeping data more time than needed, it's really a problem, because it has some cost regarding the storage, regarding a lot of things. Okay, it may be also dangerous, especially regarding some regulation, because keeping data more often or more long than it is requested may be dangerous also. So you have a way to specify to calculate the retention period correctly. That's why I'm going to express in the next slide.